It is true that the conversation started sometime last year about me being part of this conversation. And due to other commitments, I have not been able to honor the invitation, and I'm really excited to be here. And maybe I was just waiting for the opportunity to share this platform with Mpho, who has said quite interesting things about leadership that I really learned as well. So it is true that we learn until we die. So this evening, I'm going to touch on a few things that are also similar, but hopefully taking the conversation from Paul forward. So as I've already been introduced, I'm not going to go into that, but I'm going to say something that was not in my bio, because people who know me know that I work in the field of sex, sexuality, and HIV and AIDS. And that's what I read a lot on Prof. Maybe that is why I was a bit reluctant to come and speak about leadership, because my conversations are about sexuality, sexual health. So I read this every day, and recently I found a few articles that spoke about findings from different studies that have been done in different places. And these studies were looking at the sexual behaviors of men and women following an HIV test. And what they found was that men were more likely to report a reduction in risk-related behaviors such as multiple concurrent partners, increased condom use, increased health care-seeking behaviors, and treatment adherence. So what has that got to do with today's conversation? So I reflected on what I am reading and what I am seeing from these findings. And I then thought about today's conversation and how, for me, that links to today's conversation. So I work in the field of public health, where impact is of interest to us. It is of interest because we always seek to know what can we do to reduce the health risk and improve lives. And that is exactly what leadership is about for me. Leadership for me is about, let's reduce the risks and let's improve the lives. And it doesn't matter in which sector you lead. Leadership with impact is about making conscious decisions to reduce the undesirable situation and improve on the ability to achieve results and goals. And you will improve on your ability to achieve results and goals once you've dealt with the undesirable situation. So for me, leadership with impact is the gap between where we are and where we want to be. So there is that gap, and that gap is the one that presents a risk. Anything can happen in that gap, the gap between where we are and where we want to be. And if we don't have a good leader to fill that gap, then we will get stuck where we are. We will not be able to reach where we want to go because we don't have a good leader to fill that gap. So for me, what is important is that when we have an intervention, and in my field of public health, we call it an intervention. And this evening, that intervention is leadership with impact. When we have someone who is a leader and who is leading with impact, we want to see a change, just in the ways that we see the change in the readings that have been following lately. So let's go back to my example. So in my example, I would ask a question. So why does it look like following an HIV test, men seem to have changed their behaviors compared to women? So why does it look like an HIV positive test has had a positive impact on the men? So remember, one of the things that are important in us talking about the language of impact, because when we talk about leadership with impact, that means we are talking about observable and measurable effects of an intervention or of the behavior or of the leadership style or of the implementation of the strategy by the leader. But what is important is that there should always be a baseline. So we should know, where did we start with this leader? What was happening when we started with this leader? And we start with this leader, for example, at a position of an undesirable scenario. There are things that are bad. There are things that we want to pay attention to. So here we have serious goals and challenges. We've got notable areas of improvement. It is possible, colleagues, that you get into a leadership position and everything is just well oiled and it is moving, that everybody knows what they should be doing and that they are pulling their weight and policies are transparently communicated and people are following policies. So it is just possible that you could get into that environment, but still you would have to maintain that environment. But more often than not, we find that leaders are challenged. Leaders get into situations where there are gaps. So a leader is then expected to lead a strategic plan. In our organizations, we always have a strategic plan. So you have to lead with a strategic goal, and the strategic goal is contained in the strategic plan. So if there are people here from a research point of view, they will know that the strategic goal is the end line or is the post effect. It is the results of, and the strategic plan is where we are starting. It is the roadmap. It contains details of here is where we are, here is our roadmap, and here is where we want to get. And the leader is going to get us out of where we are. So the after effect should demonstrate an impact in the improvement areas that are in the strategic plan. So leaders with impact leave a footprint, and for me that has been very important throughout my journey as I have worked in different organizations. The footprint that I leave is very important for me. I want to know whether you work in government, whether you work in a community NGO, whether you work in the private sector where profits and the bottom line matters. What is important is when you were the leader, what changed? What happened? What did people experience that they did not experience when you were not in that position? So leaders who make an impact are strategy and results driven. And they know that they need to initiate new platforms so that their teams can do things in more efficient and better ways. They know that they've got to initiate new processes. You cannot be a leader and you do the same thing exactly the same way it has always been done and you expect that you will get different results. I'm sure all of us have heard that. So what is important for when you are a leader is to have the courage to improve on existing policies and procedures. And once you do all of that, once you improve on what is existing and you develop new platforms and processes, then those will be able to support the achievement of your strategy. A few things at a more personal level is that a good leader is the one who sees things and is very close and understands vulnerability. And in fact, that is very important because we need to respect vulnerability. We need to treat vulnerability with dignity, because it is in circumstances of vulnerability that your leadership will make a difference. So leadership with impact does not make excuses. We do not say when we are leaders, we don't have anyone who is available with skills to do that. Instead, we create opportunities for the skills to emerge and flourish from the team that you have to work with. You don't fold your arms and you sit and you say, I don't have anyone to take on this role. We don't ask, where are the people who can do this? Where are we going to get these people? When you are a leader with impact, you recognize human capital and you ask, how can I train the people that I work with so that they are able to do this and get ready to do it on time? We don't wait and hope that we will be able to get people delivered from elsewhere. Leadership with impact also provides institutional support for everyone to win. There is one thing about leaders, because the leadership is sometimes tied to a position. And even when it is not tied to a position, what I have observed is that when you lead, when you are in a role of leadership, whether it is tied to a position or not, you do have access. You've got access to an institution. Remember, an institution is not buildings. Yes, buildings form part of the institution, but an institution is knowing the culture, is knowing the deliverables, is knowing where to knock, what doors to open, is knowing what are the requirements for certain things to happen. That is the institution. The institution is processes. It is not the building. So it's very important that a leader is someone who has access. When people don't know what to do, they can call the person who is identified as a leader. So, because like Professor Chabane Mangaye in the book Apartheid and the Making of a Black Psychologist, leaders with impact, they believe that people, and in this book, Professor Mangani makes a specific reference to Africans, but generally, leaders with impact believe in people. They believe that people are capable of reaching the pinnacle of any profession, provided they are given opportunities and support. I really recommend that book. What the title says, it is about making of a black psychologist. When I read the book, I found that the book is a lot about leadership rather than the psychologist. Yes, he had a background in psychology and qualified as a psychologist, but the conversation in that book is very much about leadership. So when we talk about leadership with impact, it is not confined to employment, because leaders with impact are found inside and outside of boardrooms. Yes, titles are important, positions are important, educational qualifications are important. So I don't want us to underestimate the impact and the importance of titles and positions and credentials. But I want us to also imagine that there are so many people who provide leadership, and yet they are not people in particular senior positions. Senior positions are very important because they allow you to have access to particular conversations and resources that you can use to facilitate transformation in your organization. But also when your leadership role is tied to a particular position, then people look up to you to inspire them and to inspire change in their organizations. Now, this is very important because as a country, we just came out of a system that supported cisgender heteronormative whiteness. And I know that some people want to make us believe that apartheid happened long time ago, that in fact colonialism happened long time ago, and that some of us were not even here. It is true, but the impact, we know it, we feel it, and it continues to exist with us. And that is why leadership with impact are going to be leaders who speak out. Leadership with impact understands that, in fact, a particular system of governance, a particular system of state that legislated and resourced the development of a particular section of the population, in this case, cisgender heteronormative whiteness, is problematic. And it resulted in a lot of injustices, and we need to recognize that injustice. If as a leader you don't recognize injustice, you will not be able to make a change. So leaders with impact are not blind administrators and implementers of policy with no consideration for the effects that the policy has for the broader scope of things. It's very important that when you lead with impact, you ask yourself questions about the impact of the policy that is at hand that you are expected to deliver. So what this expects out of us, colleagues, is that when you are a leader, you have no choice but to take sides. Leaders take sides. And as Bishop Desmond Tutu said, if you are neutral in situations of injustice, then you have taken the side of the oppressor. It's very important that if you are a leader, because leadership is very political, we might sit here and think that it's management and think that it's about us being trained and educated and doing what we need to do. Leadership is more than that. Leadership is more than that, especially in spaces where transformation is most needed. And that is the case in most spaces in South Africa. And this leadership in these spaces is provided by what I call in this presentation agents of transformation. So we talk a lot about diversity, and we know that diversity is important, but so is bringing into leadership people who have not always participated in these spaces. I came across this demand last week when I was thinking about what I'm going to say this week, and this is a demand that 50% of the population deserve 50% of the power, and all the power, whether it is social power, economic power, political power. 50% of the population deserve that power, and we know what that means in our context. So it means that we have to reflect on whether the spaces that we are entering into are ready for transformational leadership, because leadership with impact is transformational. We have to ask ourselves questions. Do these leaders bring a culture shock to these systems? And if they do, how are we going to deal with the culture shock that they build to these systems? Because these systems are not always built for inclusive cultures. And so when some people who have previously been excluded from leadership positions, such as Black people of African descent, such as women, such as leaders from the working class backgrounds, such as queer people, when they enter these spaces, then the system is unsettled by just their presence. So it's very important that we think about that and the impact that it has. So leaders who are impactful, they defend social justice and transformation values. They actively promote the ascension of previously marginalized and othered groups. We know what we mean by othered groups: people with a disability, young people, women, single women for that matter, because these days we find that people don't talk about the diversity that exists in women. And yet during apartheid, single women could not own a property. You had to be married to do some kind of jobs and to own property. So in fact, they were systematically excluded most of the time from economic empowerment. Leadership with impact, it normalizes participation of gender non-conforming people, queer people, black people, female people, and other groups. We are not short of leaders who are promoting impact and who are promoting that we ask the difficult questions. It's very important that in our minds, the conversation that should be happening even before we get to the boardrooms, but more so when we are in the boardrooms, always ask, what does this mean for queer people? What does this mean for women? What does this mean for black people? What does this mean for the working class, etc.? And we need to gather the courage to speak out in defense of the marginalized groups. I was reading this book also this month, Raising Champions. And this is a very important book because every chapter in this book actually raises these kind of questions, which actually goes to show, like I said, leadership is not about position, because the author of this book does not hold a particular position, is neither an MEC or a minister of something or a CEO of something. But it's very important that, just like the author of this book, we carry on the baton and make sure that we ask these questions. But for me, the most important chapters, because of course I'm a feminist, I'm interested in women's rights and women's issues. In this book, in chapter 29 and 30, you will find a very interesting conversation about the position of women in the corporate and what happens to women in these institutions. So it's very important that we remember that sometimes we can be leaders and we are seen there at the top, but the culture of the institutions and the organizations does not change. And so the undesirable situation remains there. And sometimes we can be seen as organizations to have achieved transformation, achieved diversity, because we've got a black woman in leadership. And always know that that superficial leadership is short-lived. They cannot sustain it. They will not be able to replicate it. And in fact, it does not close the gaps. It is not meaningful. So when we see black people in leadership, in executive positions, without seeing transformation in organizational cultures, without seeing real transformation in policies and processes, we know what's going to happen. We observe high levels of stress and frustration in the black senior leadership. We also see management that is not supported and a high turnover of capable and competent black staff at all levels, because that is tokenism. And with that, we very often quickly see the return of the whiteness to save the situation, or so they think. We've seen this happen in other organizations and companies. I don't want to mention because everybody knows what is happening at ESCOM. Everybody knows. And we think that whiteness is going to resolve problems with corruption. Whiteness is not going to resolve our problems with corruption, black people. We are responsible for good governance in our institutions and organizations. It has nothing to do with race. So it's very important that we think about that. Part of what happens when leaders emerge and they are impactful is that they start to annoy the powers that be. And you can read a lot about this in Mangani's book. So leaders with impact know that there are repercussions to the kind of work that they do. So once the impact of their work is felt, they receive accolades. Of course, you see us receiving awards all the time, and we love awards. But we also want you to know that we also receive harsh and negative criticism, that there are plots against leaders, and that the chair can sometimes be pulled whilst you are sitting on it. We know all of this is backlash because you are annoying the powers that be, because your work has touched a nerve. The impact of your leadership has removed the privilege for some people who have been benefiting from what we know is an undesirable situation. So when people experience the tension and the tummy aches and the headaches, we know what's going to happen to leaders, because people are experiencing what I call this evening side effects of our leadership. And those side effects are not nice. They are nasty, they are painful, because people have been sitting on privilege that is undeserved for a very long time. So they also want to stop the treatment, and you should be careful when people want to stop the treatment. The treatment in this case, remember, I'm a public health specialist, is your strategies and your interventions and your leadership style. For them, it's uncomforting. For them, it results in side effects that they cannot manage, and sometimes they get very severe. So when they need to manage the side effects of the transformation that is happening in these organizations, they can really get to very unpleasant situations, and I'm going to talk about that in the next slide. So as impactful leaders, one of the things that we need to do, and thank you Prof. Majola for conversations like this, because it is in these conversations where we need to plan how are we going to manage the side effects on those who experience side effects. How are we going to build strategies around adjusting the treatment course, because we've got to achieve our goal. And in my case, because my interest is transformation, we've got to achieve transformation, and we will achieve transformation, but we just need to know what are the strategies that we can employ from time to time to get there. We also need to support teams, and that is why we are in conversations like this, so that we can support each other, because we know that the challenges are universal. Recently, we woke up to news of an ABSA CEO who has stepped down. And I know that news are not always reliable, but news we consume. We consume news, and so some of the things we know come from the public domain, from the news. And whilst some of these very quick departures of leaders can be explained in many ways, we know what is happening with this. We know what happened with Pasani Maluleke's sudden exit. We know what happened with the Director General Themba Maseko's exit. We know what happened with Mosilo Motepu. We know what is happening right now in some of our universities. We know what is happening to the Vice Chancellor of Forte, where people even faked his resignation whilst he was sitting at home, and they were circulating it around on campus saying that he has resigned. We know what is happening to the Vice Chancellor of the University of Cape Town, where the news is telling us that there is a cloud that is gathering over Professor Kheti. We know all of these things because there are people who are feeling uncomfortable with the kind of work that leaders are doing, which has an impact. Because of the backlash that I spoke about, things happen. Some leaders leave and others stay. Some are made to leave and others are managed out of their positions or out of the companies and organizations. And some leaders succumb to self-harm. Sadly, we do know people who are frustrated to their own demise. We can think of a few who have committed suicide. I know them in my sector. You probably know them in your sector. People are on depression, on anxiety pills. People leave their jobs and they stay at home. They cannot work anymore. Sometimes it's very difficult for them because of depression, and sometimes they get suicidal. But sometimes people are murdered, and we know of these things. And that's why it's very important that leaders with impact recognize what Sihle Bolani speaks about in her book. Sihle says we are the ones we need. In this book, Sihle gives a lot of description of what happened to her in terms of microaggressions and frustrations. And we know that that happens in other institutions as well, not only in the bank where Sihle works. But what is important is what Sihle is now advocating for, that we all stand together, because we are not going to get someone from outside to come and help us in this situation. We are the ones that we need. So platforms such as this, Professor Majola, are very important, so that as leaders we can meet, share strategies, talk about the impact of our work and the side effects of this impact on other people, so that we can collectively develop what we call a community of practice with intentional leaders who will not stop at anything but observable impact. And lastly, as leaders who are impactful or who are aiming for impact, whilst we appreciate immediate gains, because we all want to be acknowledged at the Christmas party of our organizations as having done this and that this year, we know that the payoffs of our work is longer term, because we don't always look out for low-hanging fruits. We do work that is impactful, that is going to be sustainable, that in the long term, people will know that we were here. Thank you.
Wow. What to say? What to say, ladies and gentlemen? What to say? Thank you so much, Prof. Nduna, for